Okay, good evening to everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight. Our session tonight is also being recorded, and it'll be available on our Young Israel Scarsdale YouTube page. So please make sure to tell your friends who may have had some other engagement tonight to check it out after we're done tonight. We are really privileged this evening to welcome into our midst Rabbi Mark Dratch. Rabbi Dratch is, for myself, and I'll speak for Rabbi Morgenstern, who it can't be here tonight. He's celebrating the Sheva Brachot for his son Simon and Lauren, his daughter-in-law. So Mazel Tov to them. Rabbi Dratch, for this last year and change that we've been dealing with the pandemic, Rabbi Dratch, in his position as executive. Make sure I got this right, executive director of the Rabbinical Council of America, has been such an incredible asset to all the rabbis out there in North America, with resources and ideas and lectures that kept us as rabbis sharp and able to continuously respond to the changing world that we've lived in. So on a separate note that's sort of not related to our topic tonight, our community is really indebted to what Rabbi Dratch has done quietly behind the scenes over the last year and change, with helping the Rabbinical Council of America be an incredible force for good in the Orthodox community. Aside from Rabbi Dratch's position, which is an incredibly important position at the Rabbinical Council of America, which he has been at for, I think, closing in on a decade soon enough. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong there. Dratch has also spent 20 plus years in the rabbinate and is a seasoned veteran rabbi and an excellent darshan. I had the great zechut as well of learning with Rabbi Dratch's son-in-law. It was a chavruta of mine, Rabbi Ari Lamm. And there is no one more fitting to give our talk tonight as we think about the legacy of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm. There's nobody who's better positioned, I think, to really encapsulate that for us than Rabbi Dratch, who's Rabbi Lamm's son-in-law, and got to see not just what maybe some of us were able to see in his roles in the Jewish community. He played a tremendous role at Yeshiva University, at the Jewish Center on the West Side, and for modern Orthodox Jewry in general. But Rabbi Dratch was able to, in that sense, know Rabbi Lamm in a way that maybe some of us didn't have that opportunity. And so it's really our privilege to have Rabbi Dratch in our midst tonight, to have him share with us his knowledge, his wisdom, and his understanding of what the legacy is that Rabbi Lamm, Zichrono Livracha, leaves with us as we move forward in this world, as we come up to the first yard site for Rabbi Lamm. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Rabbi Dratch. I'm just going to make you a co-host. There you go. Now you can unmute yourself, I believe.
That's the first time anybody ever wanted to unmute me, so I thank you for that. So thank you for that overly generous introduction. There's a lot that can be refuted. The only correction is Ari Lamm is a nephew, not a son-in-law. But beyond that, everything else is exaggerated.
I meant to say that you were the son-in-law of Rabbi Lamm. I apologize.
Not a problem.
Norman Lamm.
We're being recorded. That's all. So I just want to make sure that everything is good. So I thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you, to share some thoughts about Rabbi Lamm, his character, his contributions to the Jewish world, and just a chance to spend some time together. I'd like to also thank, first of all, Rabbi Klinger for all the work that he's done in putting this together. Rabbi Morgenstern, a big mazel tov, and to thank him as well. And to Steve Smith, who wrote and offered many wonderful suggestions that will frame my discussion this evening. Because the truth is, in the short time that we have together this evening, we don't have enough time to speak about all of the aspects of Rabbi Lamm as president of yeshiva, chancellor of yeshiva, leader of modern orthodoxy, philosopher, writer, et cetera, et cetera. When I had the privilege of speaking at the soon after the funeral, which unfortunately was on Zoom because of COVID, so we didn't have the opportunity in person to pay to him the proper respects that we should have as a family and as a community. So I'd like to quote myself for a moment, a couple of sentences which gave just a short glimpse, a snapshot of many aspects of Rabbi Lamm's personality and character, which I said, Norman Lamm was a man whose DNA was that of a Galicianer, whose mind was that of a Litvak, whose soul was that of a chassid, whose mien was that of a scholar, whose pen was that of a poet, whose tongue was that of an orator, and whose heart was that of a Baal Chesed. And just in a short snapshot, that describes many of the different facets of Rabbi Lamm, whose life was not simple, and whose character and personality were not simple, but were really very multifaceted in many ways, which made him the great person that he was. And so I'd like to discuss, to share some thoughts with you this evening. You don't need to give you a whole biography, because that you could have, you can get at Wikipedia. But born in 1927, and educated first at Torah Vodaas through high school, finally coming to Yeshiva College and then staying at Yeshiva for smicha. He got smicha in 1951 and then embarked on a career in the rabbinate. He was first assistant to Rabbi Joseph Lookstein, Zichrono Livracha, at Kehillat Jeshurun at KJ on the Upper East Side, and taught at Ramaz. From there, went to Springfield, Massachusetts for about 4.5 years until he returned to New York City, becoming the associate rabbi at the Jewish Center on the Upper West Side from 1959 until 1976, at which time he was appointed as president of Yeshiva University. He was at Yeshiva as president until the year 2003, became its chancellor for a number of years before his retirement. So that's the nutshell of the outlines of his biography, of his professional career. But of course, Rabbi Lamm was much more than that. As we mentioned, president and then chancellor and Rosh Yeshiva at YU. But in many ways, the leader and the thought leader of modern Orthodox world in the United States and beyond. The greatest spokesman for Torah Umada, for the combination of Jewish studies, of intense Torah studies with secular studies, with general knowledge. And he was able to share that and develop that through the many speeches that he gave, and through his very prolific and fruitful pen, the author of hundreds of articles in Hebrew, mostly in English, that dealt with a wide range of topics, from Torah and Jewish community policy and Israel and philosophy and Hasidic thought. His first book that he published was a small volume called Hedge of Roses, which came from a number of lectures he gave to a young marrieds club at the Jewish Center. That was really the first book that dealt with the topic of Taharat HaMishpacha, Jewish family purity, not so much from the technical halachic perspective, but more from a philosophical perspective, giving encouragement to young families at a time when the mikveh had largely been abandoned by most Jews and even by most Orthodox Jews. That book was followed by Royal Reach, was a collection of sermons. We'll get to his sermons in a little while. Torah Lishma, which was the book form of his PhD dissertation, which dealt with the philosophy of Torah study of Rav Chaim Volozhiner, which he contrasted Rav Chaim's approach to Torah Lishma with that of the Baal Tanya. His book on the Shema, collection, 2 volumes, collection of articles of 70 faces, other books of sermonics, books of the religious, of the thought of Hasidism. His book on Torah Umada, which articulated the philosophy of the educational and religious philosophy of Yeshiva University, and the book in Hebrew, a collection of articles in halacha, halachot v'halichot. It's interesting that of all the contributions and the books that he wrote, he was perhaps most proud of this slim volume in Hebrew, which was a collection mostly of presentations he made at yeshiva on the yahrzeit of Rav Yitzchak Elchanan, after whom Rietz is named, in honor of Dr. Belkin, his predecessor as president of Yeshiva University, which was a combination of halachic Talmudic analysis with philosophy and a hashkafa, a Jewish worldview. And he was most proud of that book. He said to me soon after it was published that when after 120 years, when he goes to Shemayim, he returns to heaven, and he will meet his grandfather, Rabbi Yehoshua Baumel, Zichrono Livracha, about whom we will also speak in a little while, who died when Rabbi Lamm was about 21 years old, who was a great role model for him and an inspiration for him. He says, when I go to Shemayim, I'll be able to present this book to my grandfather to show him that I accomplished something during my lifetime. Spoke about his values and about his priorities. And of course, there's much, much more to what he accomplished, of course, but that was the book of which he was most proud. He was a great Talmud Chacham, a great Torah scholar. He left Torah Vodaas High School against the will of the teachers there. They tried to convince him not to go. YU was not a place that they supported and whose philosophy they supported. And yet, at the encouragement of his grandfather, as we mentioned, Rabbi Yehoshua Baumel, Rabbi Baumel wanted him to go to YU in order to study with the young Gaon, the young scholar, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. Soon after going to yeshiva, after studying with Dr. Belkin, and maybe another year or two, another shiurim, he studied with the Rav for a number of years. Rabbi Lamm was the only one who got both his smicha and his PhD from Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik was the chair of the committee that supervised Rabbi Lamm's PhD dissertation. He majored in science while he was at yeshiva. He actually spent a year following his graduation from college at Brooklyn Polytech studying chemistry. And he was actually very torn as to whether or not to even go into the rabbinate or to go into science. I learned just today, I was looking over some old notes, that he was actually offered a full scholarship to go to medical school in Odessa, of all places, but turned that down. Got a full scholarship to go to Brooklyn Polytech to study chemistry. But there was something that was pulling him towards the rabbinate. He consulted with Dr. Belkin, and Dr. Belkin encouraged him to stay at yeshiva, which he did. Fortunately for him, and more fortunately for us, and for the Jewish community, and for yeshiva. He came from a rabbinic family. His grandfather, who I mentioned before, was a European. Got his smicha from Rav Shlomo Eger, and he came to the United. He was and became, his grandfather, Rabbi Yehoshua Baumel, was the youngest Rosh Yeshiva in the yeshiva in Viznitz, when Viznitz was still in Viznitz in Europe. It was a Hasidic family, not tied directly to any particular Rebbe, but with Hasidic tendencies in terms of practice and other types of things. His grandfather came to the United States, became a Rav of a shul in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, was the author of 2 volumes of Tshuvos, of Responsa, was a great Talmud Chacham, a great expert, and actually have a copy of a piece of stationery from the Agudas HaRabbanim. This was the RCA of the more right-wing European rabbinate at the time. And the 2 names that are on the top of that piece of stationery were Rabbi Joshua Baumel and Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. So he was a member of the Agudas HaRabbanim, a very important and prominent rabbi and a person of great influence at the time. Rabbi Lamm was a participant in one of the first gap year programs. Now our children go off to Israel for the year, for 2 years, for 3 years to study. Between high school and college, Rabbi Lamm took the year off and stayed in Brooklyn to learn with his grandfather, who had, as I said, had tremendous influence on him in many ways. But as I mentioned as well, he was a scientist, and that was an interest of his throughout his entire life, especially at that time. One of the stories that he's told very often, and may be familiar to some of you or many of you, was during the War of Independence in Israel. He was involved with a small group that secretly went to upstate New York and developed bullets for guns that would be made in Israel. There's a whole long story with regard to that. It's available on YouTube. If you Google it, you'll be able to hear him tell the details. But it was something which was done in secret, and which he was very proud to be a part of. When he was thinking about going into the rabbinate, his father discouraged him. His father, who graduated high school, so in those days was certainly a great achievement, but was involved in various businesses throughout his life, and in other types of activities. For a number of years, he was a kosher inspector for New York State. He saw what rabbis could be. Kashrus in those days was terrible. It was in a terrible state. It was a terrible business. And his father, Samuel Lamm, didn't have a lot of respect for many rabbis. And finally, when Rabbi Lamm pushed him on it, his father agreed, if you be a rabbi, fine, but you have to be a good one, and you have to be an honest one. And Rabbi Lamm became a good one and an honest one. He was a great leader, even in the rabbinate. He was a person who was extremely independent, had great respect for his teachers and for tradition, but was extremely independent in terms of his own thought, and a person of great backbone. And so I'll just give you a few examples of those types of things. Certainly, he was involved beyond the walls of his own congregation, of his own synagogue, and was very involved in forming the organizations in the early days of the Soviet Jewry movement, and was very involved with regard to that. Was a member of the Mizrahi, the World Religious Zionists of America, and was very involved in many of their activities. It's a person with a great backbone. He tells the story that when he first came to Manhattan, so one of the first halachic challenges that he had to address was that of the Eruv. The history of the Manhattan Eruv is a very interesting one, and was always the subject of great controversy, despite the fact that it had the support originally of Rabbi Menachem Kasher, who was a Gaon and greatly respected, universally respected for his scholarship and his halachic status. Nevertheless, the Manhattan Eruv was a subject of great controversy, and Rabbi Lamm, as a new rabbi on the Upper West Side, needed to take a stand as to whether one was permitted to carry or not permitted to carry on the streets of Manhattan on Shabbos. So he studied the sources, and then went to see Rabbi Soloveitchik to ask for the Rav's opinion. Rabbi Lamm told me that when he went to see the Rav said to him, "Well, I'm not an expert on Eruvin." For Rabbi Soloveitchik not to be an expert on Eruvin, halavai, we should all be non-experts like the Rav was in many subjects. He says, "I'm not an expert in Eruvin. I don't have an opinion on it, but I gave you smicha for a reason. And if you feel, after having learned through all of the sources, that the Eruv is kosher, then you make that decision. I've given you smicha for a reason." A number of years later, the Rav actually became an expert in Eruvin and developed an opinion and came out opposed to the Eruv. So Rabbi Lamm was concerned that now that the Rav had a public position, how should he proceed? So he went uptown again and spoke to the Rav. And the Rav said to him, "I gave you smicha for a reason. And if you feel, based upon your understanding of these sources, that the Eruv is kosher, then you stand by it." It was this sense of independence and the sense of responsibility towards the rabbinate and towards halacha and towards decision making that defined a lot of Rabbi Lamm's rabbinate and a lot of his positions later on during his career, when he came across into great controversy and great opposition for various things. But the Rav believed in him and believed he had the capacity to make these decisions, and Rabbi Lamm stood by them. When I was in the early in my rabbinate and had questions, halacha questions, policy questions, and I would bring them to my father-in-law, the first thing he would say to me is, "Well, what do you think? And have you studied the sugyas? Have you gone through the sources? And what is your opinion?" And it was only once I had formulated an intelligent opinion and a reasoned opinion that he would begin to discuss it with me. Sometimes he would refer me to somebody else who had specific expertise in that area. But at the end of the day, always encouraged me to take responsibility for my opinion. I was the rabbi. This was my community. He felt that I had the tools and the ability to make these decisions, and he passed on to me that sense of responsibility. He would often quote the interpretation of Rav Chaim Volozhner in the Ruach HaChaim, which is Rav Chaim's commentary on Pirkei Avot. It says in the first parak, amongst other things, that the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah said, "Ha'emidu Talmidim Harbei," that they should gather. The usual translation is to gather many students. But Rav Chaim points out that it doesn't really mean just to gather them together and have a long roster of who happens to be in the school. But la'amid is actually a hefil form, a causative form of the verb, and from the word omed, ayin mem daled, which means to stand. And ha'emidu talmidim harbei means cause the students to stand on their own. That they shouldn't just rely upon the words of their Rebbe, the words of their teacher, the teachings of their teacher, as important as that is, and as committed as one needs to be to that sense of Masorah, but teach them, Lahami, to stand on their own in order to take responsibility for their thoughts and their understanding of the text, and ultimately their decision with regard to halacha. Rav Chaim also says that when your house is open to scholars, have a mit'abek ba'afar ragleihem, which is usually translated as you should sit at the dust of their feet. But Rav Chaim points out that means to wrestle. You should be at the dust of their feet, realizing and acknowledging that they are your teachers and they are superior to you in many ways, but you have to wrestle with them, to challenge them, and to bring your own understanding to these things, because ultimately, if you're the Rav of the shul, you're the one who is responsible. So he was a person, as I said, of great backbone, and this expressed itself all throughout his rabbinate. And so one of the major cornerstones of Rabbi Lamm's rabbinate during his years, certainly at the Jewish Center, was his sermons. Today, often people, I don't know, depending on the rabbi of the shul, and you have some wonderful rabbis at the Young Israel of Scarsdale who speak well and who teach well and who have vision. But not every rabbi is able to give a good sermon, and often sermons are kind of poo-pooed and dismissed by members of the congregation. But Rabbi Lamm took the sermon and the art of the sermon extremely seriously. He at one point wrote an article called "Notes of an Unrepentant Darshan," where he speaks about his attitude towards what sermons can be and the power that they can bring. And he worked very hard at them. Because he was working at the Jewish Center with Rabbi Leo Young, Zichrono Livracha, he had the advantage of speaking not every week, but every 2 weeks usually, and therefore had more time to prepare. And he prepared. He spent hours and hours and hours preparing the ideas, the development of the thought, and especially the language. Rabbi Lamm's language was superb. He said that his father, who also was born in Europe and came here, who actually did speak a beautiful English, used to bribe him when he was a child, giving him a nickel or a quarter or something for every new word that Rabbi Lamm as a youngster would learn. And he rarely needed a thesaurus or a dictionary. His command of the language was just unbelievable. It was poetic. He knew multisyllabic words, and not only knew them, but he used them appropriately. But he had a sense. He tells a story that once Dustin Hoffman, the actor, actually came to the Jewish Center on a Shabbos morning, there had been plans to make a movie of Saturday the Rabbi Slept Late. So those of us of our generation know, remember the book. I'm not sure Rabbi Klinger even ever heard of that book. Put it on your list. And Hoffman was slated to play the part of the rabbi. The movie was never made, but he was brought to the shul to see what a rabbi is and how a rabbi how a rabbi conducts and comports himself. And then after davening was over and after the kiddush, Hoffman came to the Lamb's house for Shabbos lunch to talk over what he had seen. And Hoffman said to him, Rabbi Lamm, you're a very good actor. He says, I'm a good actor. What do you mean I'm a good actor? He says, yes, you're on the pulpit, and the way you used your hands and the way you expressed yourself and the pauses and the inflection in your voice. And and Rabbi Lamm says, you're right. I was an actor. And you have to do that because the drasha, when it's done well, has a thought that's meaningful, that's deep, that challenges people to think, that inspires their souls, but is also presented with language and with nuance and with poetry and with music. And Rabbi Lamm was a master in that. If you haven't seen him, heard him speak, or you haven't read what he has written, I highly recommend it, very highly recommend it. There are archives of his sermons at Yeshiva University Library. I think there'll be a link that will be shared with you as well. You'll see that these are interesting. He prepared, as I said, for 2 weeks for each sermon. Would deliver the sermon Shabbos morning, speak only from notes, and then Saturday night would sit down at his typewriter and type up the sermons. So those Saturday night type sermons were the ones that ultimately made it to the archives, and there are hundreds. There are hundreds of sermons that speak very well to. That reflect very well his sermonic ability and speak to the issues. He wasn't afraid to speak about issues. Sometimes they were religious in nature, and sometimes they were political in nature, although he wasn't taking a political stand, or they dealt with the issues of the day. He spoke about Soviet Jewry. He spoke about Israel. He spoke about Vietnam. He spoke about racism. He spoke about the challenges of the 1960s. He spoke about almost everything under the sun. And one can learn a lot about history and about the nature of his community and the nature of the Jewish community by looking at those archives. There were then books that were collections that were published as well. The one that he published during his lifetime through his own hand, his own works, The Royal Reach. Others, the Drashot L'Dorot, which are collections based upon the Parshat HaShavua, and others as well. You really get to know him and to see him at his best with regard to those, and understood the power of the spoken word. So whether it was the sermon or it was speeches that he gave, traveling around the world, invited to other synagogues or at conventions or other types of programs, he was able to shape the hearts and the minds of the Orthodox world and beyond during that time. You get a sense that there are many that are really wonderful. One of my favorite sermons, where you could actually hear him say them and the words just jump off the page, was a Yom Kippur sermon. I think it was Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, called "If I Were a Prophet," in which he says many things that some rabbis would like to say that to their congregations and never could. But you get a sense of, through that sermon, how he viewed the role of the rabbi. What does it mean if I were a prophet? So he contrasts the roles of the prophet and the Kohen and the priest, the roles of Moshe and Aharon. And he speaks about Moses, the great prophet, who exemplified and championed emes, truth and principle. And Aaron, the priest, the Kohen, whose main value was that of shalom, was that of peace. And we know many things about Aaron HaKohen, Ohev Shalom and Rodev Shalom. And in one of the very powerful descriptions, the picture he paints with the words, he speaks about Moses, the Navi, Moses, the prophet, who comes down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments in his hands, and he sees the people who are worshiping the golden calf, dancing around the golden calf, and he takes the tablets and he smashes them into pieces, into little bits. And Aaron, the Kohen, the priest, the one who is forgiving and the one who is soft, goes around and collects those pieces of stone one by one to bring them together again. Moses, the prophet, castigates the people, and Aaron, the priest, brings them with warmth and with kindness and tries to be makar of them, tries to bring them closer and to embrace them. And then he goes on, Rabbi Lamm says, if I were a prophet, I would speak about the lack of observance and commitment. And He says, but what could I tell you? I'm only a priest, and therefore I'm forgiving and I'm understanding and I'm tolerant. But if I were a prophet, I would tell you this, that. But I'm merely a priest, and therefore I'm not. And this goes on and on and on. And he really shares what was on his heart in a way that was people were able to understand, and people in a way that people were able to relate. And that was very powerful, because that's who he was, a person of great principle. He didn't compromise. He didn't speak down to people. He spoke up. He told me once that, quoting, I think it was Eisenhower, when Eisenhower was president of Columbia University, you have to speak not where the people are, not where their heads are, but where you'd like their heads to be. Didn't speak above the people to make himself misunderstood or speak in any obscure way, but he elevated the rhetoric and he elevated the sharing of ideas and the teachings in a way that he caused people to stretch and to reach where he was. And people would come from all over the neighborhood, all over the Upper West Side, from the East Side. People would come from out of the neighborhood and spend Shabbos in the Upper West Side just to be able to hear him deliver his to deliver his sermons. He was, with all of that, in terms of his leadership and in terms of scholarship, all the time that he was a rabbi at the Jewish Center, he was also teaching Jewish philosophy at Yeshiva University, and what was then the Ernest Michael School, which is now the Isaac Breuer College, and going for his PhD and writing his dissertation and all those things. He was a man of great chesed, of great compassion. We were overwhelmed as a family when we were sitting Shiva following his death, to hear the story not just once or twice, but dozens and dozens and hundreds of times of people, of the time that Rabbi Lamm called them, or the time that he wrote them a letter, or the time that he reached out to them, during the time he was rabbi and during the time he was president as well. There was a warmth and a kindness and a recognition of individuals, which was really superior. I don't know where he had the time to do all of that, but he did, for individuals and for the community. Mentioned before his involvement with Soviet Jewry and his involvement with the Religious Zionists of America. At one point, he was offered the position of chief rabbi of Haifa, position which he turned down for various reasons. And my time is going very quickly, at least for me. I don't know about for you, but for me, it's going quickly. That was turned down. He was offered the presidency of Bar Ilan University, which he had turned down. He was offered the presidency of Dropsy University, Dropsy College, which he had turned down as well. And when it came to yeshiva, it was an offer that he could not refuse because of his love for the institution. He had some interest. He was involved in some interesting projects as well. There was actually a bill that was brought to the Knesset that he had recommended, that he realized at some point, I don't remember the year that it was, that with the tensions between the tensions between the religious and the Chilonim and the non-religious in Israel, and the fighting over Shabbat, over transportation, over going to the beach, over other types of things, because Israel, different from North America, didn't have a Sunday. And the Sunday, people had to work. They worked 6 days a week, and Shabbat was the only time that people had where they could spend time with family and do things, leisure things that they wanted to do. So he actually had written about, and because of that was introduced in the Knesset, the Rosh Chodesh bill, that Rosh Chodesh every once a month should be a national holiday, and everything should be closed. People should be able to have time with their families. Clearly, it was not. It did not. It never came to pass, but it was a very interesting and creative idea. Another project with which he was involved at the bequest of Prime Minister Yitzchak, this was Peres. Peres had approached him one of the many times that the whole question of mihu Yehudi, question of Jewish status, came about, especially over the issue of conversions and non-Orthodox conversions. And he worked out a plan in which there would be kosher Orthodox conversions, but with the participation of non-Orthodox rabbis as well, from the Reform and the Conservative movements, as part of a separate panel that would be involved a little bit in the teaching, but in the evaluation of candidates. And this went kind of far for a while until the whole thing stalled. And for all kinds of reasons, mostly religious, political reasons, never got anywhere. The idea was resurrected the second time. Yaakov Ne'eman, who was Minister of Justice in Israel, come up with a similar type of plan, which didn't go anywhere. And we are still suffering from some of those tensions between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox in Israel, and the fallout with regard to that. I see there's some questions coming in on the chat, which I will deal with in just a couple of moments. But I wanted to just address a couple of other things. As I said, he was very thoughtful. He coined the term centrist orthodoxy as opposed to modern orthodoxy. He felt that, well, modern orthodoxy, not everything that modern was something that needed to be embraced. But the idea of centrist orthodoxy, a passionate sense of moderation in a religious worldview, really helped define this slice of the community that is that is ours. And centrist, not in the sense, he said, that it's the middle between two extreme points, and that all you do is measure the middle and you kind of parve, not going in this direction or that direction. But centrism based upon the description of the Rambam in Hilchos Deos, in which when the Rambam discusses character, says La'olam Hey Adam Sham et Deotav Tamid, that a person should always be in a sense of evaluating his character traits, his responses to things, his understanding of the world, and to figure out where he should be going and what he should be doing. Understand both of the extremes, understand the tensions and the pulls, and then make a decision. So centrist orthodoxy was this sense. It was passionate, but it was always thoughtful. And just because I thought something or believed something or held an opinion yesterday doesn't mean that is the right opinion for today. And this really described who he was religiously and intellectually, and defined his rabbinate and defined his role at yeshiva. As I said, he wasn't afraid to take stands, and sometimes he was terribly criticized. One of the most famous, or better yet, infamous events that took place was in response to a speech that he had given every 3 years at yeshiva. There's a Chag HaSmicha, a graduation for the 3 classes of rabbinic students that had finished their studies. And in one of those speeches, he spoke about Reb Shimon Bar Yochai and Reb Shimon's son, who had spent time in a cave hiding from the authorities that wanted to kill them. That when they came out of the cave the first time, they looked around, and Reb Shimon was appalled that people were wasting their time not studying Torah. They were involved in farming and planting and other types of activities. Wherever he looked, Reb Shimon's gaze would burn the fields until he was finally forced back into the cave for another 12 years. When they come out a second time, this time they gain an appreciation for the commitment, the religious commitment of people who are engaged in the world. And the details, I don't have time to go into at the moment. So he spoke about the difference between a Torah-only approach towards life and towards education, and a more worldly Torah Ummah, Yeshiva University type of model of an openness towards the world and an appreciation of the sanctity and the value of that of that world. And he spoke about those who have a Torah-only approach as cavemen, not in the sense of being primitive, but of spending time only in the cave and not engaging the world. Well, this ruffled the feathers of some people in the more right-wing world. And at an Aguda convention of Elliot Tzvei of Philadelphia, referred to Rabbi Lamm as a Sonei Hashem, as a person, according to Rabbeinu Yonah, as a person who hates God. This became a major, major controversy and got a lot of attention at the time. But Rabbi Lamm, in his very elegant and sensitive way, never responded directly to that, but accepted the slings and arrows, as it were, but it was a principle that he felt was important. I asked him a number of years later that if he had the chance to do it again, would he still give the same speech? And he told me he would give it word for word. Because while he respected others, he was a person who, when he believed something, spoke out for that point, even though he was criticized. And he was criticized at yeshiva, by some for being too much to the left, and by others by being too much to the right. He was criticized at other points as well, but he was passionate about his thoughts, and he stood with them. There's much more to be said, but we have to leave time for some questions. There were a couple of questions on the chat. Somebody asked about Rabbi Maurice Lamm. I'm sorry, excuse me 1 second. The dog is barking and I've got to get rid of her. 1 second.
If others, by the way, have questions, you can put them in the chat box and I'll try to have a little conversation now with Rabbi Dratch.
Thank you so much. So Rabbi Maurice Lamm was his brother. Rabbi Maurice Lamm was a couple of years younger. Rabbi Norman Lamm was the firstborn. But they were rabbis. Rabbi Maurice Lamm ultimately going to Beverly Hills, California, and becoming a very prominent rabbi there as well. The author of many books. One of the most famous, of course, is The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning. My father-in-law once told me that the difference between he and his brother is that his brother writes books that sell. So that was. My father-in-law had a very wonderful sense of humor, his puns, his insights. It was really amazing. Somebody had asked, how did he relate to and interact with conservative and reform movements? So he was engaged with them in a number of ways. One of his most famous and important discussions of that actually is the title of that article became the title of the 2 volumes of 70 Faces, where he speaks about the multiplicity of approaches and understanding of Torah. He felt that there was a multiplicity of ideas that were within Torah and within the Orthodox schools of thought. And there are 70, he writes, there are not 71, that if something is against halacha, it's not a valid Torah point of view. And yet at the same time, there is a Jewish world out there that is Jewish, with whom we share much in common, and we share a common destiny and share common concerns. And he speaks there about the difference between, when he spoke about Reform and conservative rabbis, the difference between them being legitimate rabbis and valid rabbis. You have to read the article because I will not do it justice in the time that we have now. But when it comes to legitimacy, that means that by law, that this is correct. And he says if a person is not halakhic, then they're not legitimate in the sense of being halakhically correct. But at the same time, they were valid, meaning they have strength. They are the rabbis and leaders of communities, and as such need to be respected and need to be worked with. And there was a lot of cooperation that he had with the non-Orthodox. He got into a bit of a back and forth with the Beis Din in England. He had been invited to address Limud, which was a program of study of Reform, Orthodox, and conservative rabbis. The Beit Din, which was very right-wing and had actually given Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, some difficulties based upon some of the statements that Rabbi Sachs had made, was opposed to this. After Rabbi Lamm had accepted the invitation to speak to Limud, he got a letter from the head of the Beis Din in England asking him not to come, actually telling him not to come, and Rabbi Lamm rejected that invitation to cancel, and he went. So he was a man who understood and was engaged in the larger Jewish world.
Someone else, Rabbi Dratch, someone else had asked about his vision for Yeshiva University, and I guess could you speak a little bit to the yeshiva that he sort of he was a student, but when he became the president, it was this, and what was his vision, and did he what do we have now today of Yeshiva University that was really the brainchild of Rabbi Lamm?
Sure. Okay. Thank you. So there are a number of things. Number one is we have Yeshiva University. When he became president, he found out soon after he became president that it was a terrible financial situation, and actually was sat down and was ready to sign the bankruptcy papers. There was a great chance that the university would not be able to survive. And he writes about this at great length. And just as he was ready to sign the papers, he put his pen down and he refused to sign those papers. And they went from being terribly in debt and an endowment of a few $1,000,000 when he first came into the yeshiva to turning things around. The endowment when he left as president was $1 billion or $1 billion, somewhere between $1 billion and $1.5 billion. He hated fundraising, and yet he was tremendously successful at doing that. So the fact that we even have yeshiva and that it exists today is due in large part to his efforts. He tells a story as well that when he became president, he spoke with Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he was asking for his advice. And he asked the Rav, what should my priorities be? What's the Rav's opinion? And the Rav said to him, first and foremost, that improve the college, which he said was shocking to him. The Rav, the great Talmudist, the great halachist, the religious leader, he thought for sure he would tell him something else. But the Rav, who himself with the PhD from University of Berlin and spoke so many languages so brilliantly, and but about the Rav, I don't have to speak about the Rav at the moment. So he put effort into that. He put effort into improving the secular education of the college. He put effort into improving the religious education of building kololim, which hadn't existed before. He understood that when he came in, the Rav was beginning to get sick, and he didn't have the force and the power of the Rav as his predecessor, Dr. Belkin, had. And so there were shifts in terms of who wielded the authority in the yeshiva, who were setting the agenda, the religious agenda for the yeshiva. And he spent a lot of time, creating a rabbinic faculty that was very, very diverse, both to the right and to the center, with different kinds of visions. That became important. He was a big proponent of the gap year program in Israel, and that really developed under his leadership. He was a big proponent of advanced Talmudic study for women, and was the one who arranged for Rabbi Soloveitchik to give the first Gemara shiur for women at Stern College, and to develop that program there as well. Development of GPATS, which was a graduate program for women in that area. So I think many of the things that we see today, Dr. Belkin built the university. Dr. Belkin came in; it was a college, and he created graduate schools, and he built the university. And Rabbi Lamm, in many ways, built upon that success by improving the programs, by engaging in the quality of the education. I'm sorry, I have to plug in my computer, otherwise I'm going to lose you. Just give me 15 seconds.
Sure. Again, if there are other questions that anyone wants to ask, we still have a couple of minutes. So you can feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will. We hear you.
Okay, I apologize for that. And I'm plugged in. The other thing, which was very important, is he really became articulated the Torah Umada. YU, had always had that on their logo. It was always talked. It was never really talked about. It was always there. People kind of lived it, but nobody actually articulated it. And he felt that as a student, when he was a student there, that he felt that was a lack. And when he came into the presidency and students were beginning to ask him, what does Torah Umada mean? He thought about it very seriously, spoke about it very often, and then wrote some articles, and then ultimately published his book on Torah Umada. So I think that was another very important contribution that he made to yeshiva.
Excellent. Rabbi Dratch, this has been an excellent presentation, and really brought Rabbi Lamm's career and his personality to bear. And so we really, really cannot thank you enough for giving your time and your wisdom tonight for us. And I want to thank everybody for joining us for this session and for the previous sessions that we've had in this series, as we remember so many Gedolim, great rabbinic leaders who have passed away over the past year. And there are so many who we didn't even get a chance to touch on. But I'm glad that we had the ability to hear about so many incredible figures like Rabbi Lamm. So again, thank you to Rabbi Dratch. If anyone wants to make references afterwards to this talk, it will be again on the YS YouTube page. And I wish everybody a good night. And again, once again, a huge thank you to Rabbi Dratch. And we really appreciate everything that you do for the Jewish people, for the Orthodox community, for our community, and your position at the Rabbinical Council of America. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.